properties that gain access from Hines Road. So the properties are currently zoned R1, which is the single family dwelling zone. And they're asking to rezone to the area outlined in red there, to the I1 zone, which is the light industry zone. So I do want to quickly acknowledge that there is a history of applications on these lands in the past for residential development.
We only see your title slide.
Yeah, slide one's the only one we see at the present time. So you advance the slides, please.
Oh, really? Did that work?
Nope.
Not yet.
It's going on my computer. They're advancing. Hold
Does
on.
Mr. Chair, does the clerk have the file? Maybe it's better for the clerk to advance the slides if they have the file.
This is Simon Rossignol. I can put the slide up. I do have the good news of informing Community Council that the meeting is now live streaming. So we are set up in that regard. There was a stream issue related to the link, but we've sorted that out. So now I'm going to load up the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Simon. Do you want me to end? I'll end on my end.
Yep, if that's okay, I'll go ahead and load up the presentation.
Okay. Virtual public hearings, never a dull moment.
I'd like to welcome all those on the YouTube channel or watching us live now. We had some technical difficulties early this evening to get it linked, but we're apparently zooming now. All right, I see slide one before us. You want to advance to slide two so we can get okay, we're on slide two now.
Okay, perfect. I will continue. So I wanted to acknowledge that there's a history of applications on the lands in the past for residential development. So in 2009, an MPS amendment application for a proposed residential development, including multi-unit buildings with a total of 254 units and 74 townhomes, was ultimately refused by Regional Council. So then later in 2014, there was another MPS amendment application for proposed residential development for 3 multi-unit buildings, 32 townhome units and 10 semi-detached units, and then as well 8 single-family homes. So that was submitted in 2014. So in November of 2019, the current case was applied for, which was proposing an industrial rezoning. So in February of 2020, the applicant decided to withdraw that previously submitted MPS amendment for the residential development and pursue this application instead. So I'll ask you to go to the next slide, please. Okay, so here's a closer image of the site. The site's outlined in blue, and the area they're asking to rezone is highlighted in yellow. So to the north and the northeast of the property is Hines Road. To the west and the east of the site are existing residential homes, and to the south of the property is the Shearwater Flyer Trail. So across Hines Road is the Royal Canadian Air Force Base Shearwater. I'll ask you to go to the next slide. Okay, so this is just a street view image looking north up Hines Road. So the proposed access to the site is on Hines Road, and it's approximately there where the yellow arrow is pointing. Next slide, please. So here's the site access, and this is just looking head on from Hines Road. So I'll get you to go to the next slide, please, slide 6. Okay. The area that the applicant's proposing to have rezoned is outlined there in red, while the yellow is showing the area that's developable within the rezone area. So there's a large wetland that you can see across part of the properties, and that's in blue there. So part of this watercourse is actually located on an area that's zoned environmental conservation. You can kind of see the EC in the map to the right there. So the EC zone cannot be rezoned under policy, and that's why they're not asking for it to be rezoned as part of this application. So the land use bylaw also requires a setback from all watercourses of 30 meters in this area. So this is why only a certain portion of the rezoned area there is identified as developable. So it's the yellow area there. I'll ask you to go to the next slide, please. Okay. So as I mentioned, the subject site's designated industrial under the Eastern Passage Cowbay MPS. and it's zoned R1, which is a single unit dwelling zone under the Eastern Passage Cowbay land use bylaw. So the site is currently undeveloped. The R1 zone permits single unit dwellings, home occupations, home daycares, and open space uses. And then again, a portion of that site is zoned EC, which is environmental conservation. The EC zone only permits conservation uses, passive recreation uses, historic sites and monuments, and it specifically restricts infilling, excavation, or alteration or grade removal of vegetation. So we have policies IND3, IMD1, and IM11, and those are within the industrial designation that allow consideration for the potential transition of residential use to industrial use within the industrial designation, and that's through the consideration and establishment of a light industry zone. Next slide, please. Okay, so the light industry zone that the applicant is proposing permits a list of industrial and commercial uses, some of which include automotive trade uses, retail stores, shopping plazas and malls, parking lots, manufacturing operations contained within a building, marine, road, and railway uses, composting uses, cannabis facilities, and institutional uses. So the current zone, like I mentioned, permits single-family homes, home businesses, and home daycares. So the applicant's not confirmed a specific use within the I1 zone. However, as with all rezonings, it's important to note that if council were to approve the application, the property owner would have the ability to apply for a permit for any of the uses listed within the zone. So the use would be required to meet the requirements of the land use bylaw and all other municipal bylaws as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a zone comparison, and that's to show you what the requirements are in the zone today versus if the I1 zone is approved. So lot coverage is higher in the I1 zone. However, the yard setbacks, you'll notice, are much larger. So for any areas of the site that are next to a residential property, the building setback minimum is 50 feet. So there's also a landscape buffer required along the side and rear yards that are next to any residential use. And that's to be a minimum of 25 feet wide of existing or new vegetation or visual screening in the form of opaque fencing. And I'll ask you to go to the next slide there, please. Okay. So the level engagement completed with consultation. We provided information and seeked comments through the HRM website, signage posted on the site. We mailed postcards to property owners, and we held a virtual public engagement meeting on Wednesday, December 9th of 2020. 9 members of the public attended that virtual public information meeting. So throughout the course of the application, we received 7 phone calls and 7 emails from the public over the course of the application. There was 144 unique page views on the website at an average of 4 minutes spent on the page. So the public comments included the following topics. There were concerns regarding potential traffic in terms of volume, but also the size of industrial vehicles, concern with larger vehicles and a turning radius onto Hines Road, concerns about speeding on Hines Road, which is currently an issue and is suspected to be worse or more dangerous, with larger industrial vehicles. Concerns that Hines Road is inadequate in terms of infrastructure, concerns that it doesn't have sidewalks for children, and that increased volume and industrial traffic could be dangerous for residential families in the area. Concerns that it's narrow and doesn't have a shoulder. Concerns that the industrial use will result in larger trucks, making it more dangerous for members of the community to access the Shearwater Flyer Trail. Concerns that the applicant hasn't provided a proposed use within the industrial zone. So the public kind of voiced that they don't know what to expect within the zone permitted uses. They had concerns that some of the listed uses seemed more intense than others. There's a few more concerns here. Concerns regarding environmental impact of industrial use on wetland areas and concerns over private drainage and flooding. The concerns regarding potential infill of wetlands, concerns that residents are already surrounded by industrial use and that more industrial uses would further take away from their sense of community within the neighborhood. And then concerns about private screening not being maintained, and the community would prefer to have an existing tree buffer to not be removed. Finally, concerns about tree buffering being removed from Shearwater Flyer Trail. And then the final comments from the community were that they felt as though the existing R1 zoning would be most appropriate and beneficial for the current housing crisis in HRM. I'll ask you to go to the next slide, please. Okay, so the enabling policy requires that council consider a list of things before making their decision on the rezoning application. So these include the adequacy of sewer and road networks, as well as that controls are placed on the site for the types of use, building height, lot coverage, setbacks, traffic generation, access to the site, parking, and open storage. Next slide, please. So the Eastern Passage Cowbay Municipal Planning Strategy highlights the importance of industrial lands within the industrial designation. It recognizes that there's existing residential in the designation, but it highlights that industrial use is of priority in the designation. So it includes policies which allow council to consider transitions of residentially zoned properties to industrial use, and it establishes a specific set of provisions and controls in the land use bylaw to prevent the intrusion into the residential community. So these things that are in the land use bylaw include increased setbacks from residential uses. That's that 50 feet side and rear yard setback that I mentioned before. Vegetation buffers, again, minimum 25 feet wide, or fencing, opaque fencing. So the portion of the site proposed to be rezoned has wetland located on it as well. The Eastern Passage Cowbay Land Use Bylaw has a set of provisions that any development on the site would be required to meet. So this includes a watercourse setback of 30 meters or greater, depending on the slope, and that's applied during as-of-right permitting. Additionally, should the developer propose a watercourse alteration on the site to alter the wetlands, they must apply and be granted permits from the Nova Scotia Department of Environment. And again, that EC zone portion of the lands are to remain zoned as such, and no alteration of wetlands in that zone are permitted under land use bylaw provisions. So stormwater and drainage within the development would be subject to HRM municipal design guidelines and Halifax water designs and construction specifications. So pre-development and post-development stormwater discharge values are required to balance on the property. So all of these things for site grading and any kind of drainage would be reviewed at the building permit stage and would have to meet those requirements. Finally, a traffic study was reviewed by HRM Engineering. So some of the details reviewed by HRM Engineering included access to the site, existing traffic conditions, trip generation, visibility, driver stop sighting distance, and traffic impacts on surrounding streets. So the findings in the traffic study concluded that new trips generated by the proposed rezoning were expected to have a minimal impact on the existing traffic operations in the Hines Road corridor. So our HRM engineering department reviewed that, and they did not identify any issues with the information that was submitted in the traffic study. And next slide, please. Okay, so just to kind of summarize, the industrial designation allows for the potential transition of residential use within the industrial designation through the consideration and establishment of the light industry zone that the applicant's asking to rezone to. So any use permitted in that light industry zone would be subject to the requirements of the land use bylaw, which have been written specifically to be consistent with the intent of the MPS policy. So the policy considers existing residential development and zone provisions that are included in the land use bylaw, again, to specifically reduce potential land use conflicts for any new industrial lands abutting existing residential. These provisions include those increased setbacks, screening from residential use. So additionally, consideration is also given in the land use bylaw to the protection of watercourses and wetlands. Appropriate areas were given the environmental conservation zone, and watercourse setbacks are established in the land use bylaw for all other watercourses and wetlands on the site. So finally, staff recommend that the Harbour East Marine Drive Community Council approve the land use bylaw amendment as the proposal is reasonably consistent with the intent of the industrial designation. Thank you. And now I'll open it for questions.
Before we go to the applicant for their presentation, are there any comments or questions or clarification from the councilors? Councillor Kent.
Yes, thank you. I have had a chance to get a lot of my questions answered well prior to we put this first reading, but today I just want Brittany, can you tell me what year it was that designation, the industrial designation, was actually applied to these land use bylaws for this area?
Yeah, so it was written in 1992. That would have been when the land use bylaw, the MPS area for the Eastern Passage Cowbay was established. So it would have been around 1992.
1992, 30 plus years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
No problem.
Councillor Mancini.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Brittany, thanks for the presentation. Once you finally got it going, that's great. Were there any comments from residents when you, any feedback with regard to the light industrial dealing with the composting and cannabis? I know part of it, as you stated in your presentation, no obnoxious fumes, those type of thing, but was there any feedback from the types of businesses that or operations that could potentially go in there?
Yeah, sure. So through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor, the community did raise concerns about the types of uses in that light industrial zone. So cannabis facilities was one, and also people were curious about the composting facilities too. So when we looked at it, the constraints on that site make it very difficult for anyone to come in and get a permit if it was rezoned. So specifically for composting facilities, the setbacks from the property lines are like 328 feet from any property line, 1,640 feet from the nearest residential dwelling, and again, 328 feet from any water course. So there would just be no possible way to meet separation distances on that site for a composting facility. And then again, with cannabis facilities, there's a minimum of 230 feet away from any property line abutting or a lot or zoned or used for residential properties. So the site shares abutting property lines on two sides and then a public trail park on another. So we just kind of quickly measured, and based on those measurements, it would be extremely difficult to propose any kind of facility on this site. There's a very small area. I mean, technically, if someone got super creative, I can't say that a site wouldn't be able to be proposed on this site, but it would have to be very small in order to meet any of that land use bylaw requirement.
So thank you, Brittany. So to understand this correctly, and for those that are watching and to be clear on this, even though the designation of the light industrial allows those types of industries, they still have to apply and still be approved. And so what you're stating now is most likely be very difficult for those types of businesses to be approved on that site, even though it allows for it, right? I just want to be clear on that. Thank you, Brittany.
Yes,
Appreciate
correct.
it. Mr. Chair, thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Kent, you still have your hand up, or are you finished? Okay. Okay, any no further questions or clarification from members of council? We'll go now to the
Councillor Purdy has a question.
Okay, sorry, Councillor Purdy.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I didn't know I was supposed to put my hand up there. Sorry. Yeah, I had a question about follow-up, so like compliance for the environmental impact for the wetlands there. Is it procedure to follow up in 12 or 18 months after a bit or an industrial use has been set up, just to make sure that the business is operating in compliance to the bylaw, or is that just complaint driven, any type of follow-up?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor. So for anything dealing with wetland alterations, that goes through the Department of Environment. So any member of the public would go and contact Department of Environment. I'm not sure exactly what they do for follow-up. As far as our land use bylaw requirements, when a permit is issued, it has to meet everything in the land use bylaw. I'm not sure if there's a follow-up other than just the routine building inspections when things are when they go through that permit phasing. I'm not sure if once all of those inspections are completed, if there's a follow-up. But I do know that depending on the type of use, there are also industrial, like say if you had I don't know, some kind of facility there, there's also separate regulations that they have to follow under. I think it's Industry Canada or something. So they have follow-ups too. But generally, if the community ever called 311 to do a follow-up, then if it falls under our land use bylaw regulations, then yes, we would go out, a compliance officer would go out and follow up and make sure that those land use bylaw requirements are being met.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councillor Austin, you're satisfied with that answer? Okay, thank you. Hearing no further questions for clarification from members of council, I'll now ask the applicants presenters. I believe we have Chris Marquise and Jamie Copeland. Are they online with us? Hello, can you acknowledge that you're online with us, please?
Yes, Jamie Copeland is here. Hello, Chris McKee is here as well.
Thank you. You have 10 minutes, folks. Who starts off?
Thank you. I think that I have a presentation. Is it Simon? Are you able to share that? Great. Thank you so much. Good evening, Mr. Chair and fellow councillors. My name is Chris Marquides. I'm a planner with ZAP Consulting. I'm joined today by Amy Copeland from Griffin Engineering, who's assisting on this application. We are representing Armco Communities on this application. I'm here tonight to advocate for the rezoning of Armco's lands abutting Hines Road from R1 residential to I1 light industrial. Next slide, please. Our client is seeking rezoning for a part of their lands fronting on Hines Road. This area is highlighted in red as seen on the slide. While there's been no specific use identified for the site, it has become clear.
I think we lost audio.
Intended to be located off Hines Road and will require a wetland alteration permit from the Department of Environment prior to construction. Next slide, please. The municipal planning strategy for Eastern Passage Cowbay is clear on its goal to preserve lands for industrial uses, and as a result, the subject property is designated industrial. The industrial designation was applied to lands which defined the major industries at the time of adoption, as well as lands that were where there's a reasonable expectation of industrial expansion. Specifically, policy IND3 of the MPS recognizes the potential transition of residential lands to industrial uses and establishes the light industrial zone to be used to accommodate that expansion. Therefore, it is clear that the intent of the MPS is to allow for expansion of light industrial uses in the industrial designation. Next slide, please. As I mentioned previously, there is no specific intended use for the site yet. However, our client has indicated that there are several uses that are being considered and a number of uses that are not being considered at all. The uses that our client is considering are in blue, and the uses not being considered are in red. So note that even if our client were considering a composting operation or cannabis production facility, these uses would not be permitted on the property as there are additional land use bylaw requirements that prohibit them in this area. As Brittany mentioned, the setback requirements, I believe the abutting zone requirements.
Mr. Chair, sorry, the slides are catching up to them. Sorry.
Yeah, they're red and blue. We just got up to them now.
Yeah. So your slides just caught up with you, Chris. Just hang tight. So we're on slide 4 right now.
The cannabis production facility would not necessarily be permitted on the site because of the setback requirements and the abutting use regulations. Next slide, please, Simon.
Okay, we're on the opportunities for community growth title.
Okay. Yeah. Over to Simon, but let's see, we can go with this one. That's okay. I'll talk a bit about the industrial need for industrial space in this area. First of all, the industrial vacancy rate has gone down 3% in the last year. Yeah, there we go. This coincides with an increase in warehousing and logistics demand due to changing market conditions and supply chain conditions due to COVID-19. And there's a need for this smaller industrial spaces that are essential to research and development and manufacturing operations that is not being captured in the market currently. So this is something that our client is considering providing on this site. And there's an opportunity that exists for industrial spaces to allow for small and medium business growth. Next slide, please. Yeah, next slide, please. This was the same slide there. Continue. This is not the correct presentation, Simon. Sure. Okay, we can start from here. So one of the items brought up at the public information meeting was the separation requirements between residential and light industrial uses. So the MPS addresses this by providing policies that require buffering between residential and light industrial zones and are administered as part of existing land use bylaw. Industrial buildings must be at least 50 feet away from side and rear lot lines, in addition to the required visual screening. Next slide, please. So in summary, we are requesting that council support the recommendation from HRM staff to rezone these lands to light industrial for the following reasons. The property is designated industrial, and the MPS policies support expansion in the light industrial zone in that designation. The land use bylaw provides the necessary guidance on separation between uses, traffic and parking requirements. And that our client is considering a limited scope of uses that reflect existing and growing market demand. Next slide, please. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to present to Mr. Chair and fellow councilors. And I'm happy to answer any questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Is Jamie making any presentation?
No, Jamie's here to answer questions around traffic and the traffic impact and the traffic impact statement that he prepared. If council has any questions around that. Okay.
Opportunity now for councilors to have some points of clarifications. Councilor Kent, please. Audio, please. Audio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a few questions. So based on the slide presentation, so the need for industrial space is down by 3%. Where are you getting that data? And like what area is being considered as part of what makes up that data of that 3% loss?
Is Jamie or Chris going to answer that?
It's Jamie here. I'll defer to Chris on that. Traffic engineering is my area of expertise, so I'll pass that on to Chris if he's still on the line.
I'll ask my other questions, and maybe when we get to that point, someone can answer them. So the other question, another question I have is the anytime industrial is adjacent to residential, and Eastern Passage, the Shearwater area is no stranger to it. There are issues around pollution and that barriers, constructed barriers on the ground can't address. And I wonder if you've given any thought to this around light pollution and noise pollution. The folks up in that area are inundated on a daily basis with noise pollution and noise disruptions, very noisy industry area related to CN, to the volume of trucks that are transporting in and around that area. The other is light pollution, an ongoing issue that is related to safety, but it is certainly already at play in that area, coming from the Autoport area where they're staging the loading and unloading of the big trucks moving the cars. The lights have come. It's a serious concern right now that I'm working with CN to try to address. And I want to raise that to see if the people you represent have given any thought to that. The last question I have is I want to actually see and hear what you have to say on slide number 1 around opportunities for community growth. I'm really curious what you have, what it is you're trying to get at there.
Thank you, Councillor Kent. I do apologize, but I think Chris has, for some reason, I don't see him on the list of attendees on our meeting, so his connection might have been lost. I can specifically address any of those questions. Oh, I see Chris has just joined us back there. Chris, are you on the line?
Yes, sorry, councillors and Mr. Chair, I got booted for some reason. So, Councillor Kent, unfortunately, I didn't catch. I only got part of your questions. So,
okay, Mr. Chair, do I have permission to carry on again?
You can summarize quickly for your questions.
Yeah. Sorry. Thank Thank you, Mr. Chair. That was disrespectful, wasn't it? Saying with a smile. So I am curious, your 3% figure that you showed as being the industrial space is down. I'm really curious as to where you got that information and what catchment area makes up that 3% being down. And if it, because I'm trying to relate it to potentially down within the area that it's focusing on here, because there has been actually expansion of industrial activity out here. And there is also some reconfiguring of the Valero lands, which used to be the original Texaco refinery. So in fact, I think that in this particular area may be in contradiction to that. So the other is, have you given any thought to, and have the proponents given any thought to how you would mitigate light and noise pollution? The folks in this area have been constantly dealing with the noise, of course, associated to rail, associated to truck and transportation activity, and then light pollution when you are surrounded by industry such as what we have with Shearwater having been an Air Force base where runways are at play. There's a lot of light, and now more recently the Autoport area that actually is adjacent. Oh, that's my husband's lawnmower. Isn't that nice? He just got home. Can you hear that? Is that interrupting you? No, good. It's bothering me though. The light pollution is awful. And in fact, it's an ongoing and very serious situation that we're dealing with right now. Have you given that any thought? The third thing is your slide number 5, which you didn't get to speak to. Opportunities for community growth. I'm wondering if you can put that back up when you have a minute and speak to that, because I'm curious what actually are you getting at there?
Sure, yeah. So the first question around vacancy rates. So it's a increase in demand indicated by a decrease in vacancy rate. So a 3% decrease in the vacancy rate for industrial space. And that's coming from Cushman Wakefield's quarter one market study or market report from 2021. That's for Halifax as a whole. Unfortunately, I don't have any more fine-grained information than that, but that is a fairly significant drop from quarter by quarter. As you can see over time, you've had a pretty steady decline. We had some space, as you mentioned, that came online at the end of 2020, and that has been absorbed very rapidly, as you can see, from between kind of quarter 3 2020 and quarter 1 2021. That vacancy rate has dropped pretty significantly. So your second question around mitigating light and noise pollution, I believe that the land use bylaw has language around light and lighting and how lighting is handled in industrial zones. From a noise perspective, the noise bylaw, Halifax noise bylaw, does apply here, is my understanding. Maybe Brittany or Carl on the line can clarify that. But my understanding is that the noise bylaw is in effect still, even with industrial properties. And lastly, the opportunities for community growth. Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, as mentioned, that was kind of a presentation that was presented at the public information meeting, so it was a little bit not less applicable in this situation because we were trying to discuss with the public what opportunities there were. But again, there are some opportunities here for growth and for aligning with potential partnerships with the community, with other small businesses in the area, maybe new startups, that kind of thing, that for this kind of space and use.
Can you be a little clearer about what the community would have in way of opportunities?
There may be potential for smaller industrial spaces, manufacturing spaces, if that can integrate with the community in terms of, maybe there are members of the community that would like that kind of industrial space nearby, or that was close to it. Like if they live there, they'd be close to where they work, kind of thing. That's where we're getting at with that. Got you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Mancini has some questions of clarification for the presenters.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Chris, thanks for the presentation. So when the Councillor Kent spoke earlier, she talked about your client wasn't quite sure what they were going to do with the land other than get the designation. So can you help me understand, do you know that is their intent just lease out the land to other companies to sell the land, or they have business of their own that they're going to be putting in the land?
My understanding is that that has not been worked out yet. They're waiting either for a potential partner. They're not an industrial operator. So it would come around to either if they can find a tenant that would want the industrial space. They've been in conversations with I think tenants previously, but at this point there's no tenant there. Potentially somebody wanted to buy it and develop it industrial lands that was an industrial developer. That would be something that they would consider as well.
My second question, Mr. Chair, if I may, to Chris, is that, you know, we do have examples of where residential and light industrial live next to each other that can work. We have examples where it doesn't work very well. When it works well, my experience has been there's a really good line of communication to the landowner and the residents when there are issues. So I don't know if you've had any conversation with your client about that, about, you know, once they decide what they're going to do, they may sell parts of it. They may lease. Obviously, there's the window's open for them, what they want to do. Has there been any conversation on how they will communicate with the residents?
At this point, I mean, I assume they will have leasing materials available if this were to pass. As far as communicating with residents, I think it's kind of more up to the individual business to market themselves in that area. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure what to.
I know it's a tough question to answer. Maybe plant that seed with your client. You know.
Yeah, that's certainly something that they can consider for sure.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome, sir. Any other questions or clarification from any members of council for the presenters? Hearing none, then I'll go to the public hearing portion of the meeting. I'd like to thank those who are joining us tonight for this meeting for public hearing case 22651. For those who had to speak tonight, they had to pre-register as of 4:30 yesterday. And we have one person registered. We have Dave Phelps from Eastern Passage. Mr. Phelps, are you on the line with us?
I am.
Okay, Mr. Phelps, you have 5 minutes to make your case known in regards to this particular matter. The clock is now running on you, sir.
Yes. Well, good evening. As you said, my name is Dave Phelps, and I live at 116 Howard Avenue, which is directly adjacent to the properties for which Armco and ZZAP are seeking rezoning. I have provided a written submission about my concerns and those of my immediate neighbors relating to the proposal of ZZAP on behalf of Armco. My purpose of speaking here is to question whether or not A, you have received that submission, and by the sound of it, you obviously haven't read it because the comments I've heard so far are totally in opposition to what is provided in the my submission. So first off, have you received my submission? And secondly, I would like to ensure that it's read into the official record of this meeting and provided within the minutes for distribution.
You use your 5 minutes to speak your case to let you know that your correspondence has been received, plus the number of others. So that's going to be acknowledged after you finish speaking.
Okay. I would applaud, I guess, for the first time, Becky Kent. She raised some issues that my neighbors have raised. I'm not going to go into detail speaking here for 5 minutes. I spent 2 weeks writing the submission, so I can't really summarize it in 5 minutes. But if this evening's proceedings are any indication in terms of organization, etc., I think we need to reconsider the methodology. The comments by myself, I guess the one main thing I'd like to raise is Brittany McLean's first slide that showed the site. Is that available for me to make comment on from Brittany McLean?
You're to make your case from the information you provided. You know, we've seen your correspondence. You have a picture of the site and your correspondence and everything else. So,
Yes, indeed. And so I guess in general, the site is too small to develop industrially. The size of the wetland is much greater than what they show in their plans. The available area is about 1.65 hectares as it sits today. And we, the residents, would ask that you reject the application. And if Armco is absolutely intent on some kind of development, that he develop it as an R1 development at his discretion. We are absolutely opposed to an open-ended, that means without any information regarding what might be put in there, rezoning from R1 to an I1. And the MPS, as Becky suggested, was done in 1992. The industrialization of Eastern Passage is long past. The Valero property is probably going to be opened up. The Esso property may be opened up. And I don't think there's been any proposal down in Eastern Passage based on the development of that housing development down there. No industry and no multi-unit dwellings were part of that proposal. So we as a community would seek to leave the present zoning as is and have Armco make a proposal for an R1 development. And thank you for your time.
thank you, sir. Any questions or clarification? Councillor Kent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Phelps, for coming out this evening. I know that you attended the community meeting that was done through this process as well, and we did receive your information. My plan would be to speak to some of it when we finish this layer of the process. I'm just curious, though. This is a response by a community group. Can you just elaborate on when you say that? You talked about surrounding area, people that have reached out to you. I know you kind of are a go-to leader for some of the people with your willingness to step up and voice your concerns. So just clarify that for council, please.
Okay, above the Trans-Canada Trail, I walked around and talked to the various occupants of the properties. Below the Trans-Canada Trail, I haven't talked to anybody because they're not directly impacted except on Hines Road relative to traffic and all the issues that have been raised at that previous meeting. So when I'm talking about the community group, I'm talking about me and the top of Howard Avenue and those on Vivian Lane and Maple Lane that I've talked to. So I'm representing opinions that have been represented to me by them.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Well, I appreciate you coming out this evening and sharing your views. I really appreciate the detail that you put into your submission. It's really helpful, and yeah, so thank you very much.
Thanks, Becky. Appreciate it.
Councillor Mancini, you have a question for Mr. Phelps? Audio?
Sorry, I didn't take my hand down from last time. Sorry, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for any members of council? Hearing no more, he was the only registered speaker to speak tonight, so I have a motion to close the public hearing, please.
So moved.
So moved.
Moved by Councillor Kent, seconded by Councillor Mancini. All those in favor of closing the public hearing, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed? Motion carried. Okay, so I'll go now for debate, but before we do that, Mr. Clerk, can you acknowledge the correspondence that was received in this particular case tonight?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, there were, I believe, 3 pieces of correspondence, all related to the public hearing this evening, and those have been circulated to all members of the Community Council. And
they are part of the public record, Mr. Phelps was concerned, but they are part of the record. That's okay, correct. Thank you. All right, Councillor Kent, I'll ask for you to put a motion on the floor and then we'll start the debate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As per the process, I will put the motion on the floor that as it's required. The motion is that Harbour East Marine Drive Community Council adopt the amendment to the land use bylaw for Eastern Passage Cowbay as set out in attachment A of the February 10th, 2021 report. So moved, and then I'll speak to it.
For a seconder, please.
Second.
Seconded by Councillor Mancini. All those before we call the question, I'll ask for the debate. Councillor Kent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just so for anyone who's listening, that is a requirement that we have to put the motion on the floor. It doesn't necessarily mean that we support it. So now I'm going to speak to it. I have given this a lot of thought. I have been driving up and around that area. I've been out on the trail area. I've been really trying to get a good handle on what's at play. So I think, well, no, not I think. I want to state straight up at the beginning that I can't support this application. I am very, very concerned, as are others in the area, and I've talked to people who have had this kind of experience in the past, that there's no intention identified. It really does leave open a very wide open opportunity for what I believe could be a higher risk to the area. I'm concerned on many levels, so I'm going to just kind of wind my way through it. And when I think about this, I think about the area of District 3 that is speaking to the industrial designation. And I think about how many years ago, over 30 years ago, probably 40, of all the talk around industrial expansion and creating jobs, and we live, we have rail, we have hot roads, we have the water. And so it made sense that we would put things in zoning and designations in place to address the opportunities for expansion, for industrial expansion. And I am absolutely in favor of creating jobs. I'm in favor of opportunities for locals and in different industries. But I'm not okay with the complete surrounding and over populating any one area that has residential involved in it now, because that's what's at play now. Don't know what was at play back in the late 80s and early 90s, as far as I think many of the homes and such were up in that area, but they were open to, people here were probably open to the idea of jobs. And of course, people still want jobs now. But since then, the area of the industrial expansion in all that area has continued to grow around them. The Shearwater area has continued to grow. The McAsphalt, which is just at the bottom of Howard Avenue, and in the back of my picture, in the picture in my background, in fact, is Autoport Avenue, and so McAsphalt is there. We have the auto rail. We have the shipping and transportation industry full on in full capacity there. As it was already spoken to as well, down the road, we have an area of past Shearwater and past this area where the old Texaco refinery was, which was then Ultramar and is now Valero. They're going through a remediation process, and that is all designated industrial. Up the road towards Dartmouth, we have the Imperial Oil lands. We have these wastelands of industrial designated areas. And I just cannot come to grips for this area, particularly the residents who are at play here. It just doesn't feel appropriate to completely surround them. R1 is what we need. Housing, access to housing is a real problem. Armco has been a good developer in the Eastern Passage area. They've developed a significant amount of single and double occupancy housing infrastructure. I recognize that they're probably frustrated with the applications that they put forward. I can't really speak to the reasons why they failed at that time. I think they were heavier and denser than maybe was palatable at the time. But that's what we need, not this industrial space. When we think about from Highway 111, I spoke to it, all the way down to up Cowbay and right to Colwell Road, there's a lot of industrial in this area. Hines Road traffic is a problem. I spoke to it at the community engagement piece. I've spoke to it at the first reading, where there are serious concerns for me on behalf of the residents and the infrastructure that's there. Our municipal infrastructure is already saturated with a lot of heavy traffic and active traffic that is a consequence of the capacity for traffic flow within this area, which I think I'll put a little plug in for the Shearwater connector to Colwell Road would be really great, because I think that could alleviate some of that as well. Right, Councillor Purdy? Stormwater management, absolutely. The environmental impact here, I think I'm very sad to see how much clear cutting was already done there. But the environmental impact, and I think the presenter here, he was able to articulate as well that I think that the impact of the EC zone is, I think it has grown. And Mr. I forget your last name. Sorry. I'm looking for it here. Anyway, doesn't matter. It's problem. It's concerning. It is already impacting the residents that are in that area. And I can't see this making it any better. Again, I'm all for creating jobs. I really do have concerns around using this designation that was developed plus 30 years ago as the reason to allow for this designation now, while we know that housing is a huge priority given the vast amount of industrial zone that's down here. So I know it's frustrating. I recognize that for ARMCO and for ZAP. I did have conversations with them as well on housing. There's not an appetite for that right now. I hope that should this not pass tonight, that they'll go back to the table and look at that. I know that many people in this area are benefiting from the housing development that ARMCO has done in the past. I do also want to note here that presenter put forward that Mr. Phelps, that back in the presentation, he's suggesting that back in 2014, when ARMCO was actively pursuing the development of townhouses and multi-unit buildings for this site, they stated that the industrial designation was no longer appropriate due to the fact that new wetland protection measures had been brought into effect in the 1990s. And that's specific to this parcel. If you look at this parcel and the size, I can't imagine what they can do. I think that they're frustrated with getting some usage of their land, but I hope they'll go back to the drawing table. So with that, I'll leave it there. And I am asking for council to vote against this application. I think there's a better use and a better ability to really have a very positive impact on this area if they keep the R1 zoning. Thank you.
Councillor Austin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Councillor Kent, for the remarks and the clear ask of us. So, as I look at this one, it is kind of smack in the middle of existing residential areas. And I think coming from our community planning committee meeting this morning, I think we probably have a good example of the challenges that we have very outdated plans throughout the municipality. I can't think of anywhere else where I've ever seen a provision that allows you to convert residential into industrial lands. It's a rather odd one that is, I suspect, very much a relic of its time and place. But it is the plan that exists now. And so my question for staff, if council votes against this, as the area councillor is asking us to, is the decision appealable, or is this a purely discretionary item on our part?
Who can answer that? Mr. Purvis or Madam McLean?
Or Mr. Judith?
Or a solicitor. I see it.
Through you, Mr. Chair. I think probably all three of us can. I'll take a stab at it first, and then maybe Carl can jump in, or Josh. But it would be appealable to the UARB. The policy, correct, as Councillor Austin said, is the current policy. Whether it's outdated, it is from the 1990s, but it is the current policy that we've reviewed the application against, which is why staff gave, it was relatively consistent. So that's why staff gave the recommendation that we did. In the event that policy needs to change, perhaps an MPS application for change, if the councillor wanted to ever look at that in the future. But as of right now, yes, that application is appealable. Carl, did you want to jump in any more than that?
Can I follow up with if this is appealable and council is going to reject it, do we not have to be very clear about our reason for rejecting it as well then?
Yeah, through you to the councillor. Maybe Josh can speak to that, but yes, I believe council is to provide any reasoning for why it does or does not meet policy. Josh, did you want to add anything to that?
I think that's correct.
Okay, so that leaves me in a bit of a bind because I'm not sure what our policy piece might be in terms of rejecting it. Perhaps we can circle back to that one. My own feeling here, I would like to support the area councillor. I fear, though, that this is be careful what you wish for, as our esteemed now ex-colleague Councillor Walker would say, when there was 2 residential proposals in the past for this property, and now they've opted to go the industrial route. I know which of the 3 I would have rather had in my backyard, and it would not have been the industrial. So I will see what my colleagues have to say, because we will have to identify our a policy rationale for why we're voting against it. Thank you.
Okay, any other comments from councillors? Councillor Purdy or Councillor Mancini before I go back to Councillor Kent to close the debate? Councillor Purdy, you have a comment there? I see your hand up. Councillor Purdy?
Yeah, hi, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I do. Mr. Phelps had mentioned this in his correspondence, and Councillor Kent also just said it, the environmental piece. Would that not be in the 90s when it was said that this parcel of land, it would not be appropriate to be used as industrial? That's why it was designated R1. Would that not be something that could be used in favor of rejection of this?
Do we have a question? Is that a question for staff? I'm trying to...
Brittany looks like she's frozen, so maybe I'll pinch hit for her. Oh, nope, she's back. Never mind.
Am I back? Okay, perfect. Yeah, I mean, the site was in the MPS when it was written in 1992. The site was designated industrial, and so that planning policy that went in there said that, we know that there's residential zoning in these areas, but that council could consider rezoning that residential use into industrial. So even though the zone was zoned residential, I'm not sure the exact date that it was zoned residential, but the MPS does identify that, we've designated the lands industrial, and that there is potential and value in taking those residentially zoned lands and allowing them to have zones which are allowed in that designation. So I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Councillor Austin, does that answer your question? Or Councillor Purdy asked that question. Sorry, Councillor Purdy.
Well, it's an answer, so thank you.
That's diplomatic. Any other questions of councillors before I go to Councillor Kent? Or does our solicitor have a comment to wish to make?
Yes, through you, Mr. Chair, to the council. I just draw your attention to alternative 1 in the report, staff report on page 6. I think that provides a concise summary of the situation. So it reads, Community Council may choose to refuse the proposed LUB amendment, and in doing so, must provide reasons why the proposed amendment does not reasonably carry out the intent of the MPS. So reasons why the proposed amendment does not reasonably carry out the intent of the MPS. And then it goes on to say that a decision to refuse the proposed amendments are appealable to the Utility Review Board, has already been mentioned. But I think that's a clear sentence.
So Mr. Chair, may I ask in relation to that?
No, before I go to you, Councillor Austin had a point of clarification or question on that before I go back to you to close.
I have a question on that too, sir.
Okay, all right. Councillor Austin, you had a question?
Yes, Mr. Chair. My question, and trying to throw a bit of an assist here, is there, I mean, to me, the main challenge with this site as industrial would be the proximity of the residential that was all around it. I don't know if this site was always like that, or if this has been something that has arisen with time in the area. It does, as I look at the criteria in the report, I mean, I'm more familiar with my own Dartmouth land use plan that has compatibility type language in it. Is there anything in that we would consider regarding this rezoning that would be in that same vein? Because it's the compatibility with the residential that I think from a planning perspective would be the strongest argument if council is to vote this down.
Is there, I think that was a question for the solicitor or for a planner?
I think it's more of a planner question. Is there anything in our plan that would allow us to say, well, we're going to vote against this because we don't feel it's compatible with the residential adjacent uses?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor. So I know which policies you're speaking to. A lot of them are in the Dartmouth Land Use or the Dartmouth MPS. You're correct. So there is policy here that says that the proposed development must have control to reduce conflict with any adjacent or nearby land uses. So that would include residential uses. And so those things include the type of uses, the height, bulk, lot coverage, things like that. And the main thing was that the designation set out a specific zone, which gave extra planning tools, such as those 50-foot setbacks against residential. So the zone was really set up so that if residential land was ever rezoned to industrial, that there would be those things to reduce land use compatibilities. So like I mentioned, that's the 50-foot setbacks there from any residential, and the 25-foot landscaped buffer or opaque fencing. So those were the tools that at the time when that MPS policy and land use bylaw regulations came in, that was the tools that they had used in order to reduce that conflict. So if council feels that maybe those tools aren't adequate, I'm not sure on that end. When we did our planning review, those were the tools that were set out, and so they were consistent with the policy in the MPS. So that's what our review concluded.
Okay. That is helpful. I don't know if it's helpful in us in winning a UARB thing, but it is helpful advice. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, Councillor Mancini, before I go to Councillor Kent.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm wondering if Brittany, you can help me with this. So if we were to approve the R1 zone, when you list in your presentation and in the report, it lists what that includes, can we eliminate some of the items? Are there items that are deal breakers for the residents? Maybe this is a question more for Councillor Kent, but from a procedure point of view, are we allowed to say, here's the R1 zone, however, we exclude X, Y, and Z from it? Because we've had a similar situation in my district where we went down that path. we're able to eliminate the things that the residents are totally against. Now, it's very difficult to do this on the fly. This should have really been done before we got here tonight, but is that a possibility if we vote in favor of the R1 zoning?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor. I'm going to call on Carl for this one. I know that would be a land use bylaw amendment on top of just the regular land use bylaw amendment for rezoning. I'm going to ask if Carl Purvis might be able to speak to that process, if that's something that we could do at this point, or something we could consider during this application. I'm not sure if he's there.
Yep. Hi, Council. Mr. Chair, through you to the councillor. So basically, if you were to want to change the uses in the zone, you could do one of two things. You'd either have to create a brand new zone, which is to say, this is the zone for, and we do this sometimes. This is the zone for 123 Main Street, and here are the uses that are allowed on 123 Main Street. The other option would be changing the entire zone itself. So changing that I1 zone for this property, but also impacting all of the other properties. So those would be the only two options that you would have. The creating a new zone, it may end up being, and I don't know this off the top of my head, it may end up being a plan amendment that would be required in order to do that, which is, as you know, a bigger process. But ultimately, the tough part about this would be where the industrial designation, it informs the bylaw.
Right.
So it starts at the designation, it goes down to the bylaw. So it's where the industrial is the designation. It's hard to find the lightest touch of industrial use in terms of the lowest intensity industrial zone. It's hard to find that inconsistent with the industrial designation ahead.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Carl, thank you for that. And I bring that up more for Councillor Kent as one of the items in our tool bag that should maybe be considered as we progress with this, but I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Councillor Kent, you had a question of clarification for staff before?
No, I'm good.
Okay. If I could speak from the chair, I'd like to just make my comments known. As stated, this municipal planning strategy was written initially back in the early 90s, 1992, 93, when it was finally approved back then by the county. Since that time, initially, these areas were zoned industrial because of the compatibility and the proximity of the railway line. The Dartmouth subdivision line used to go from Cosar Lane right up and stop it till Hines Road meets Caldwell Road, so that it would have been compatible to have industrial zone lands beside a railway corridor. But since that time, that railway corridor in the Dartmouth subdivision area has been lifted. The only area you have for subdivision or railway capacity is on the spur lines that cut down below the main road and service the autoport. So the intention in the early days was to have that industrial land capacity by the railway corridor. Now the railway corridor is gone, and we've seen residential development occur, and this is what I call an area of integration interface with the residential area. So I think it's been developed and evolved over time to be less industrial and become more residential. And that's why it probably got rezoned to an R1 zone some time ago to allow for residential opportunity. The only problem with this property is the environmental zone on it because of the amount of wetland there is. So it limits the capacity of what can be really done there. The only usable lands are by the railway corridor, or now, which is the trail, the part of the Trans-Canada Trail system. So I see this as a land that was in transition from industrial to residential, and I see that this proposal is not compatible with the residential components of that we see now emerging in that area. And I think that a more of a residential application would be probably more acceptable for the neighborhood than an open-ended industrial use. So I'll be supporting the councillor and voting against this particular application. Councillor Kent, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your comments. Thank you for the comments from all of my colleagues. I've been mulling over a little bit of what Councillor Austin noted, which is concerns around appeal, what's it called? I'm sorry. I'm listening to everybody and I'm trying to
appeal to URB.
URB, yeah.
So review board.
Yeah, so I just want to be clear that the residential applications that came forward on an R1 zone where R1 being single family homes, maybe I think maybe duplexes are involved. They were asking for a much higher density. So at that time, the issue was defeated. It was defeated. It was over 250 units in an area, of course, where they were concerned with traffic and such. But on April 12, 2011, Regional Council held a public hearing and refused the proposed MPS amendments. The refusal was based on several concerns, including lack of compatibility with adjacent neighborhoods, traffic concerns, density concerns, and pedestrian traffic access. Discussions at council indicated the developer should work with the area residents to address these concerns prior to submitting a new application. So that speaks to me is that those are all the issues that I brought forward. They're issues that Councillor Hensby spoke to. They're issues that we are speaking to. I am willing to take that risk, and I do not believe that this is compatible. I really appreciate the articulation that Councillor Hensby just spoke to. I can't say that I know that the folks at ZAP, they were forthcoming in trying to get some information and information from the community, but I don't feel like we really got to where there was a real good dialogue on residential opportunities. So I don't know. I can't support it. I'm hoping that you won't. I do strongly believe that Armco still has opportunities in keeping with what they have done already out this way successfully. And I would look forward to having more conversations with them on that front, and that I think is much more palatable and appropriate for this area. So with that, I'm going to close my remarks. Unless anyone else has anything to add, I'd like to close the public hearing.
Hearing no further question or comments from councillors, call for the question. All those in favor of the motion has been on the floor, say aye. Those opposed say nay.
Nay.
Negatory. The motion has been defeated. Are there any other further motions to come forward at this time? We're saying no to the application. Okay. All right, that's it for that. We have no variance hearing tonight. Correspondence has already been acknowledged. Are there any petitions or for presentations? We have no delegations tonight. Are there any petitions we file, members of council? Hearing none. Information be brought forward. There was none. Reports, discussion, motion. Any motions be brought forward tonight, council? Here, seeing none. We have no in-camera business. No added items, council. None. Notice of motion. Anyone has a notice of motion for consideration? Hearing none. Public participation. We're now at that part of the agenda for public participation. I'm not sure if they have to pre-register for this. Mr. Clerk, you could clarify that for us, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, that's correct. We have no registered speakers as of this time.
Okay, thank you. The date of the next meeting is scheduled for June the 3rd. Is there any other business members of council for the Harbour East Marine Drive Community Council? Hearing none, I'll take a motion for adjournment. Councillor Purdy, I assume?
Yes, let's adjourn.
Motion to adjourn is
Getting
been
good
called.
at that.
It's my expertise.
Before we adjourn, I just want to acknowledge the artwork of Bob Pettypaw from Woodlawn, Dartmouth. He's a photographer and artist extraordinaire. This is part of the Nova Scotia Strong. If you can buy his artwork, all in support of Nova Scotia veterans. Thank you and have yourself a good night, everyone.
It's Traffic Safety Week.